Oh, hi, Mark. Cell Count is a film that I watched just the other night. It is a 2012 horror film directed by Todd E. Freeman. It stars Robert McKinnon, Haley Talbot, and Ted Rooney. The film centers around a group of chronically ill people who are taken to a government research lab and are promised cures to their ailments. And obviously, as this is a horror film, not everything is as it seems, and they basically have to escape before their time runs out. So I originally bought this film because it was cheap. It was like $2 at a thrift store, though I wasn't really expecting a ton out of it. But as far as I'm concerned, I got my money's worth and more. Right off the bat in this film, I was actually really surprised by some of the performances. Haley Talbot starts off the film with some really good emotional acting, especially for a movie of this low of a budget. As well as just generally throughout, I'm actually rather satisfied with the rest of the cast, and generally speaking, I think this is probably better acting than we get in a lot of lower budget horror films like this, save for a moment or two that I'll get into later. I also really appreciate the concept of the movie Cell Count. The facility therein reminds me a lot of the facility from the movie Deadpool, oddly enough. Except in this movie, they don't intentionally torture you. They're not trying to unlock superhuman capabilities in you. But the cure turns out to be less than perfect. So yeah, they're actually trying to cure these people, but unfortunately the cure is kind of fucked, and it doesn't really work out the way they want it to. Basically, the cure to these people's illness is this nasty-ass parasite thing that feeds. It literally feeds on the illness in their bodies, or in your body, and pretty much when it runs out of illness to eat, shit gets nasty. For example, there's a character called Tiny Tim in this movie, and I'm pretty sure he's supposed to be like a serial killer or something. In any case, the guy's about as nutty as a payday bar. But anyway, he has one of these things inside of him, and basically it gets hungry and it decides to come outside of him. This thing shoots out of his mouth, and it wraps around his face. It's like this flat worm-like thing, sort of, and it like wraps around his face, his entire head. It basically makes his head look like it's cling-wrapped in the membrane from a Rocky Mountain oyster. If you aren't familiar with that reference, basically a Rocky Mountain oyster is a bull's testicle, and wrapped around the bull's testicle is this really thin membrane, and it's like this really veiny, nasty looking thing. It looks like really thin skin, and you have to remove that before cooking. You're welcome for describing that to you, by the way. I truly hope at some point in your life you eat Rocky Mountain oysters and it haunts you as much as it does me. Setting aside the balls that I put in my mouth, yeah, we'll roll with it. It also kind of leads me to one of my dislikes about this movie. These parasites aren't explained very well. So, although these things are really nasty and really gnarly, and they're really, like, scary looking, and they work really well for a horror film, I do wish they would have explained them just a little better. They explain that these things eat the disease inside of your body, and that, well, they do the Rocky Mountain oyster membrane thing when they get hungry, but then they just kind of don't explain why this happens. Like, what does the parasite get from this action? It just leads me to wonder, like, what is the practical reason that this happens when it runs out of disease to eat? I wonder that. We don't really get an answer to it, but it sure does look creepy. It's also just kind of inconsistent as far as the effect it has on living beings. One point or another, there is a non-human being, an animal, I don't know why I didn't just say animal, that has one of these cures inside of it, and as opposed to it Um, as opposed to it wrapping around the animal's face, it just kind of decides to spontaneously combust for some reason. Although I will say that scene features one of the most insanely nonchalant reactions ever from John Breen, and I'm there for it. Like, the moment doesn't work in the way that it's supposed to work, in the way the movie wants it to work, but just how unwaveringly normal and nonchalant everyone, especially John Breen, is acting after this thing happens makes this scene absolutely hysterical. When you watch the movie, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when that scene comes along. The only other acting I really had an issue with in this movie comes from, I think his name is Christopher Toyne, as Dr. Brandt. He's not distractingly bad or anything, it's just he has like this German accent, and I don't think it's real. Maybe it is a real accent, and I'm just an asshole, but to me, it wasn't a very convincing accent at all. Also, another thing in this movie I just thought was kind of funny. Don't get me wrong, it's cool, but I just thought it was kind of funny because it doesn't make any logical sense. In this movie, are the guns that the characters use are so insanely random. Like, there was one guy with a PPSH, there was another guy with a Thompson, there was another guy with, like, a Gewehr. It was like this government facility just had, like, World War II weapons, and, well, actually, just whatever weapons were left over from, like, the first two World Wars shipped over to their facility. The government was like, yeah, there you go, that's what you're gonna use. And it's just like all the country's weapons, like, here's a Russian PPSH, an American Thompson, and a German Gewehr. Go nuts. If nothing else, at least it looked pretty rad. I mean, obviously, all these guns look pretty rad. What doesn't look rad is the facility itself. It just kind of ends up looking like a prison that was painted headache-inducing white. On top of the fact that the facility is just painted this headache-inducing white and it's just not pleasurable to look at whatsoever by any means, another thing that I didn't really enjoy about this facility was how small it felt, because obviously this is a low-budget film, there are budget constraints, and as a result, this movie ends up taking place in about 4 or 5 different set locations. And I understand that's probably a budget restraint, or a budget constraint, rather. And yeah, it's probably just a budgetary thing, but it does end up getting old, unfortunately, and just kind of boring. Speaking of boring, this movie takes a bit to get going. I will say that after that initial kind of lull in action, and I mean, just from the beginning to like 30 minutes, I mean, it felt like a while because it was kind of boring. It was a lot of character information, stuff like that, stuff you expect, but it was just kind of boring. And I mean, once it gets going, once the movie decides to put its big boy panties on and really start moving, then things become interesting, and the movie did have me. I will admit, after that initial little, this is kind of boring, and checking my watch, it does get interesting, and it's definitely worth sticking around for. The way this movie ends, pretty sure it was trying to set up a sequel. This movie was obviously really low budget. I don't imagine it made a lot of money, so we probably, it probably wasn't going to get a sequel anyway. But, like, I have a vision of what the sequel to this movie could have been, based on the way the movie ended, and the vision of what the sequel could have been is pretty glorious in my head. That is, if it was given a sufficient budget to flourish, and, the director was given a decent little budget to work with. Nothing major, but my vision of the sequel was actually pretty cool. and where I felt the story might have been leading. But unfortunately, the last article I saw written about Cell Count 2 was in about 2013. And IMDb still categorizes this thing as in development. So I have like just a sneaking suspicion that that this thing isn't going to happen, unfortunately. Also, there's this plot point in this movie that's not fully explored. One of the characters has this weird thing where he almost seems like he's from the future. It almost seems like he's having like premonitions or something. Maybe he's a psychic. I don't know. It's kind of this really weird, far out there thing that the movie was trying to do, and it never fully explained that either. Just another one of the things in this movie that was never fully expanded upon, and you're just kind of left expected to believe, alright, this guy's a psychic for no apparent reason other than, like, the movie just wants you to believe that. Like, that's... Here's that information, do with it what you will. And also, he's talking to the attendant lady that is constantly, like, narrating over their day-to-day lives, like the Siri of the facility. I have no idea. He's like talking to a physical representation of her that like visits him in his sleep. I don't get it. I don't know that the movie fully got it, because it sure as hell didn't let us in on the secret why any of this was happening. But it's something that I would imagine would be expanded upon in the sequel, and like I said, we're probably never going to get that. So as of now, we just kind of have to accept it for just kind of a weird thing that they decided to have in the movie for reasons, I guess. If the reasons are there, maybe it's just in there because the director thought it was neato. I really couldn't tell you. Although it sort of kind of sounded like I was trashing this movie for a couple of seconds there. Believe you me, I'm not trashing this movie. I actually really enjoyed my time with this movie. As much as it did have some lulls here and there. Some parts got kind of dull, you know, this and that. And it had a couple of maybe plot holes in there. But it was an interesting movie with an interesting concept that definitely got nasty at parts. It played upon one of my biggest fears, which is parasites. Parasites freak the fuck out of me. So these eel things that were like in them, terrifying. One of the characters even says in this, I forgot who it was. I think that was Ted Rooney. I could be wrong, but he says, whoever it is that plays Abraham, it was that guy. I think that's Ted Rooney. And he even says, when I was a boy, one of my friends got a tapeworm, and they described to me what it was. And he says, I just thought there was nothing more vile than the thought of something living off the things inside of you. And that explained exactly how I feel about parasites and stuff. So this movie definitely, like, there were scenes, it was getting nasty enough to where I was kind of like genuinely my mouth was ajar. But you know, it's probably due to the fact that I have a fear of that anyway. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen for everybody, but for me, it did. I thought it was nasty. Obviously, the movie's not all peaches and cream. Movies very rarely are. But, you know, overall, I thought it was a pretty solid flick and a really enjoyable time. And I think I'm actually going to give Cell Count a 6.5 out of 10. Alrighty, guys. I really appreciate it if you stuck all the way through the end. And if you did, and if you enjoyed it, why not subscribe? It's not like you have anything to lose in this scenario. Okay? Yeah, I'm looking at you, Chuck, sitting on your couch and ham-fisting hot Cheetos into your mouth to numb the pain of your recent divorce. Just hit that like and subscribe buttons, Chuck. Do it. Alright? Refraining from doing so is not going to make your wife come back. Okay? Just put the hot Cheetos down. Subscribe to the channel. Then you can pick the hot Cheetos back up. I promise. Really. Truly. Anyway, guys, your ex-wife might not love you, but I do. Anyway, guys, I hope I see you on the next one.